Welcome back, hyenas! Today we're talking about the tremendous amount of Pokémon leaks that have come out after a Game Freak employee evidently was hacked over the course of the last weekend. I'm sure some of you guys are excited to see what's released in this information. Unreleased assets from previous and future Pokémon games, early development stuff, lore, specs about Nintendo's next console. I mean, I guess if you're a nerd, the really interesting stuff has to do with a bunch of early development lore that's been written about these games. For instance, did you know Mudkip wasn't originally going to be a Gen 3 starter, and instead they had this thing? Did you know the character of Skyla, the pilot gym leader from Pokemon Black, is evidently based on Jennifer Lopez? Did you know that Magikarp is evidently a pseudo-legendary in the lore? Not spicy enough for you? How about Typhlosion kidnapping and impregnating a young child? Sumito, none of this stuff is as interesting as the Vaporeon copy pasta. What if I told you Octillery is actually the most compatible Pokemon for human Pokemon breeding? It's in the lore. Guess they don't call themselves Game Freak for nothing.
That's a lot of nuts!
A couple quick things to touch on before we get into the juiciest bits of the leaks. A, yes, I'm sick. That is why I sound like this. You don't need to ask in the comments. B, just because it's unreleased stuff doesn't necessarily mean that it's canon. It's way funnier to think of all of this as real, but the reality is when you're making something as big as an entire world that exists with creatures and dynamics, there's gonna be some creative liberties that go into artwork that doesn't make it into the games, stories and lore, exploring the dynamics and relationships and politics in this world that you create that only exists as a creative outlet and an exploration of ideas, more than it is how are we gonna fit having sex with Pokemon into our children's game. And C, something I think we can all agree on, Nintendo is going to dismember this Game Freak employee. His life is in danger. Nintendo has been known for being very litigious, very protective of their IPs, most notably shutting down Smash tournaments because they weren't regulated by Nintendo. More recently, finally suing Pal World, the game that was advertised as Pokemon with guns for, being Pokemon with guns. With Nintendo being as anti-consumer as it is when it comes to people making content about theirs, I'm surprised Scott the Woz hasn't been shot in the back of the head. When it comes to one particular employee who leaked all of this information, Nintendo is gonna strap him to a rocket and fire him into space. But hey, what's one dead guy compared to 4 or 5 kinda funny memes about Pokemon? I'd make that trade any day. Let's talk first about some of the unreleased Pokemon, because aside from all the crazy stuff, that's probably what would be the most interesting to you if you heard that Pokemon had some sort of big leak. The biggest meme to come out of this is, of course, the scale of, yeah, this looks like a Pokemon, to, oh my god, what sort of eldritch horror did you create, Nintendo? The biggest piece is, of course, this water-based rabbit Pokemon that was supposed to be a Gen 3 starter, which, as you guys know, the Gen 3 starter, if you wanted water, was Mudkip, which means this thing was supposed to replace Mudkip. It reminds me a lot of Score Bunny, but I do think that's just because they're both rabbit-based Pokemon. I do think it's a cool design, but the biggest thing to come from this thing being leaked onto the internet is everybody showing that they weren't real Mudkip lovers to begin with. How could you even conceive of replacing Mudkip? He's the best! The next super interesting piece of lore seems to be a diagram depicting the absolute origin, the creation of the Pokemon universe, and as such gives us a hierarchy of what Pokemons are considered gods and legendaries and what came from where. Most of this information I am grabbing from Central Leaks on Twitter. The actual leak itself is like over 1,000 gigs of images and text, some of which contain personal information, a huge amount of which is in Japanese, so I'm a little bit at the mercy of other people who have already done the work to research which one of these things is interesting enough to come to the top of Twitter. If you consider that bad research on my part, I totally understand, but I'm doing my best here. This Pokemon origin states that there was an empty galaxy and out of nowhere came some sort of egg, which then ended up hatching into the ultimate god Os. Os is evidently Arceus, who was then attacked by fragments of the egg, eventually defeating all of them and then turning the left half of its body into Dialga and the right half of its body, light and dark for whatever reason, into Palkia. This diagram shows pretty much everything you could expect out of this. I mean, everything seems to have come from Arceus, but then you see the Regis, the legendary birds, the legendary dogs, everything, Mew, Dragonite, everything that you would expect out of the gods of the Pokemon universe. But if you look closely over here to the left, there is a Gyarados right next to Tyranitar and Rayquaza, which seems like a more common Pokemon than should belong on this chart of gods. But despite the fact that everybody's under the impression that Jirachi and Deoxys are legendary Pokemon, most people wouldn't consider Gyarados, and by proxy a Magikarp, to be one of the Pokemon that created the universe in which you play. But hey, I always knew there was something special about Magikarp, even if I always got made fun of for having one. According to Central Leaks, evidently there is no such thing as a pseudo-legendary as far as Pokemon are concerned. You either are a legendary Pokemon, or you're just sort of a fan favorite, but you don't have any relation to the Pokemon that end up on the covers of the games and the really tough ones to catch in-game. But now, thanks to this chart, it seems as though there are a few Pokemon, like Gyarados, that are related to legendary Pokemon, despite not being legendary themselves, so the moniker of pseudo-legendary is evidently real. That's like insane nerd shit. Just to be clear, I feel like you'd only really appreciate something like that as like a die-hard Pokemon fan, which I like to think I am, but like somebody out there probably is pissing their pants at learning that Gyarados is a pseudo-legendary. Next up are a few interesting pieces of descriptors for in-game characters that you might not expect Nintendo to go for in a game designed for 4th graders. First up is Cyrus, the leader of Team Galactic, who you might meet in Generation 4 and onwards, is described as a perfectionist, autistic. Finally, in-game representation that reflects me as a player. Slightly more interesting is Skyla, the gym leader from Pokemon Black, described as a sexy pilot, and one of the descriptors has her related to one Jennifer Lopez. Finally, a representation in a Pokemon game that reflects me as a player. Last, but certainly not least, we're going to take a look at the lengthy number of stories that have been written discussing the relationship between humans and Pokemon. Most of these are written in a tone alluding to some sort of like folklore or like ancient mythology, old school thinking of how Pokemon and humans used to relate back in the day, none of which has been revealed in games or canonically, were probably created as like a writing exercise for creatives on the team to just put together some sort of information about Pokemon and humans that may or may not get used with total creative freedom, but regardless, freaky. In the distant past, where the boundary between Pokemon and humans was still blurred, there was a woman and her companions. Every day, they were bored, so they would often catch Slackoth, living in the nearby forest. They played cruel games with the captured Slackoth, sometimes killing them for fun, gouging out their eyes, or cutting off their ears. What the fuck? One day, the woman was walking alone in the forest and saw a Slackoth hanging from a tree. She climbed the tree to try to catch it, but slipped and hurt herself. At the moment, a Vigoroth appeared. The Vigoroth had a torn ear. The woman, startled, tried to flee, but her injured leg hurt too much and she couldn't move. The Vigoroth with the turned ear suddenly attacked her. When it saw her, the woman lost consciousness. She ends up waking up in an unfamiliar place by a lake where she sees a tremendous amount of dead Pokemon and a ton of other injured Pokemon, realizing that all of these Pokemon were the same Pokemon that her and her companions had killed and or tortured. Upon seeing all of this, she passes out again. When the woman regained consciousness, she found herself at the entrance of the forest near her home, surrounded by her friends. They carried her back to her house. Sometime later, the woman gave birth to a child, but it wasn't a human child, it was a Slackoth. She intended to abandon it, but couldn't bring herself to do so. She stopped meeting with her friends and decided to raise the Slackoth. Her friends came looking for her after not seeing her for a while and found her child, the Slackoth. Thinking it was any other Slackoth, they killed it. The woman then, finding the dead body of the Slackoth, her child, grew dismay, ran into the forest, ended up at the same lake with all the Pokemon she had tortured over the years, holding the body of the dead Slackoth, and then jumps into the water. Afterwards, the woman's friends began to treat Slackoth as companions, just as she had her final moments. Woo! This piece is titled Theme Original Sin, based on the current Pokemon world, and is evidently supposed to be some sort of big, drastic thing that happened that led to Pokemon and humans living in peace many thousands of years later. But boy, is this a lot for a kid's game. The next story that has caught people's eye is titled Theme: The Collapse of Culture and Relationships, which outlines some sort of fisherman who meets up with an octillery on the shores of his house and then makes love to it several times before one day, when looking for it, finds a child. The child, seemingly half octopus, half man, but just described as a normal boy, goes on to kill a bunch of Ursa rings and then has to beat one to death with his hands for some reason. I don't really understand what the consensus and moral of the story is supposed to be at the end of this one, but it's not like it really matters, because the only thing that anybody has taken away from this sizable short story is the fact that somebody had sex with an octillery. And last, and probably the most memed upon story to come from this collection of behind the scenes early development lore, is the story of Typhlosion, titled Theme: The Relationship Between Humans and Pokemon / Human Ways of Thinking. In this story, a young girl from a village is going to collect firewood when she goes deep into the forest and discovers a Typhlosion that speaks to her and basically tells her to come live with him. He feeds her berries, tells her to collect firewood, and upon not listening to his instructions of collecting firewood from the highest branches so that the humans don't find them, he eventually tells her that it seems as though your father has come looking for us. If you don't pick the firewood from the right part of the trees, he will come kill me, and you don't want that because I'm your husband and you're my wife now. The girl decides to continue collecting firewood from the lowest parts of the trees. The Typhlosion recognizes this and tells her, your dad is going to be here soon. He's going to kill me, take my eyes, take my heart, take my voice, and burn them in a fire. Her dad shows up. He kills the Typhlosion. She says to her dad, that was my husband. I've been living with him this whole time. Please give me his eyes, his heart, and his voice. She burns all of them in a fire and then gives birth to a Typhlosion human hybrid. She is made fun of by others in the village because of this and eventually ends up leaving. And it states at the end of this story that from that point on, everybody understood that Typhlosion are part human. Unfortunately, the internet has just considered this, that Typhlosion are part P. Diddy and part Dr. Disrespect. The memes have been wild. Multiple people making parody thumbnails of Typhlosion in all the same predicaments that you would see Minecraft YouTubers. People making screenshots of Typhlosion putting out an apology. This has been a wild week for Pokemon. All of the leaks are currently actively being translated and searched through. I'm sure there will be more and more funny, interesting, behind the scenes lore and early development stuff, and perhaps even real pieces of information about future Pokemon games that might make its way into mainstream media, which is all pretty dope. That's everything that I found interesting so far. If you guys enjoyed this video and want to see me in your inbox more often, remember to hit the subscribe button. A big thank you to the patrons, who will probably be the only ones who can see this video on my Patreon after Nintendo inevitably takes it down. As such, I'm SumitoMedia. I will catch you guys in tomorrow's video. Thank you so much for watching. Peace.